Hi there. I'm Styx. I'm going to give you a little background about how the idea of roles came about.
What's this thing about roles? I heard it has something to do with fields that we just learned about. Is that right?
That's right. I'll explain the idea very briefly, and then I'll tell you more about where the idea came from.
Thanks.
Okay, we just learned from Harriet that groups can be understood as fields with particular atmospheres. And when we are in a field, as we learn, we tend to get pulled into various positions. Like this. From the viewpoint of consensus reality, especially when there's conflict, those different positions are usually pretty fixed and static. Something like this. Now, as we learn, when we shift perspective to the dreamland level, the various sides do not only belong to those particular people or groups. Rather, all of the different sides are more like roles in a field that everyone shares to some greater or lesser degree. Meaning, those roles don't only belong to those people, but are shared by everyone to some degree.
Would you say that again?
Of course. In other words, in Dreamland, we can experience a group not only as a bunch of real people, but as a field with many shared and interacting roles. We'll see some examples of sharing roles, or what's called role switching, in the next section.
Normally we just see people who are firmly on their sides of a given issue. This is a shift in awareness.
Yes, that's right.
But wait a minute. If we share all of the roles in a group field, that means that I'm like the other people on different sides than me? Even those I'm against? That's radical.
Perhaps. But in some way, we all know the various roles, or at least their energies, inside of ourselves, to some greater or lesser degree, in Dreamland. And this shift in perspective is a central key to world work, facilitation, and to our world's future.
I'll think about it. So, tell us more about where these ideas come from.
Okay, let me tell you some of the background theory now. I learned it at a process work school. To start, we need to go back to the earlier discussion about group fields and atmospheres. You might remember that atmospheres in groups might feel heavy, light, intense, or they could be exciting. Everyone feels the atmosphere, but it's rarely noticed or discussed consciously. But we do tend to feel the field's effects in our bodies. I know, my body is a little unusual. Anyway, this is where things start to get really interesting. Alright. Do you remember that circle we talked about earlier in the film that showed people in fields? You might remember that Arnie described a group as having a field-like background. And when we are close to a field, he noticed that we tend to feel pulled into various sides or positions. Something like this. Now, to understand this, do you remember anything about fields and magnets from school? If you don't worry. I hope I don't bring up too many school complexes. It's actually pretty cool. So, if you hold a magnet underneath a piece of paper that has a bunch of metal filings on it, they will tend to polarize into various positions. Something like this. The iron filings show how they tend to line up in the magnetic field. In other words, we can't see magnetic fields, but can detect them using a magnet and iron filings.
You're saying all of this has to do with people?
That's right. As we learned in an earlier section, fields are powerful and invisible, and can also pull us about. To understand this, just remember a time when you entered into a particular field. Like, for example, a family meeting that was kind of tense or conflictual. You may have felt pulled into one role or another, even if you weren't feeling that way before. And you suddenly began to take sides with one person or point of view. Or, imagine that you get near someone who's in a really bad mood.
I remember that once, I was suddenly really irritated with that person, even though I wasn't feeling that way before.
Exactly. And Rebecca, you wanted to come back and give another example.
That's right. There are other types of fields. For example, in a field where someone is feeling very hurt or depressed, you might suddenly feel very loving or parental. Those are the two roles in that field. So, Sticks, maybe you can explain to those who are watching why fields tend to pull us into different roles.
Great question. Arnie says that fields seem to want to get to know themselves. That is, to become more conscious and aware. It's pretty interesting. You can read more about that in his books. Okay, now let's take a closer look at the concept of roles and typical polarities in groups. As I just showed before, when we're in a group field, it tends to pull us into various roles or polarities, like the magnetic field. In our human fields, there are often two main roles or polarities, and when there's conflict, those roles are usually very different and not easily brought together. Some of the most general and main polarities that come up in groups are good and bad, rich and poor, powerful and weak. When some people have been marginalized in a group, there is usually the role of the rankful marginalizer, and another role of those who are put down and hurt. And of course, there are other roles as well. I also want to mention that Arnie described roles as time spirits, meaning roles associated with the time in history, as well as characteristic of the particular group and its environment. We don't have time to go into that more here, but you can read more about time spirits in his books. For now, let's go on to the next section on role switching. This is exciting. See you later!